were primarily heterosexual female undergraduates from a mid-sized private university. All experiments were conducted in the research lab with random assignment to condition. And basically, we used a written priming methodology, which is a very common way in social psychology of activating various psychological and motivational states. So it's been used to activate mate search motives or feelings associated with social exclusion. And we wanted to see whether or not we could use a similar type of procedure to basically activate experiences or states that we expect to be associated with father absence or paternal disengagement. So again, the first experiment was just kind of to see, can we do this? Would we get effects if we just asked girls to come in and think about a time that dad wasn't there? And if so, would they be shifts that we would expect to see based on what we know about paternal investment theory and the specific targeted effect that it posits for fathers on daughters' sexual outcomes? So here, we wanted to test whether or not we would see effects on women's sexual attitudes and their sexual perceptions. So would they begin to perceive sex in stimuli that are somewhat neutral or even ambiguous? Would they be more accepting of casual sexual relationships? So these are the effects that we wanted to test in our first set of experiments. So again, across all of these studies, participants came into the laboratory and they were randomly assigned by our computer program to one of two conditions. And participants in the experimental condition were asked to think about and describe a time that their father was absent for an important event. So this is an excerpt from the exact instructions that they received. So they were asked to take a few seconds to think back to a time in your life when your biological father was absent for an important event when you really needed him. Describe in detail how your father's lack of support or his physical or psychological absence made you feel. So I'll give you all a second to see if you could think of anything. So just to kind of give you a sample or an example of sort of a prototypical response that our participants gave. The only event that I can think of is when my father did not come to my state tournament in golf. The team and I worked very hard every day in order to become the first state participants from my high school. It was a huge letdown that my dad didn't get to come because of all the effort that I put into it. I felt alone, embarrassed because everyone else's parents were there except mine. I felt very disappointed and let down. So this kind of hits on some of the common themes that we saw across these prime responses. So let down, feeling disappointed, feeling alone, feeling embarrassed. So states that we expect would be activated in response to lack of paternal investment. And participants in the control condition were basically presented with the same exact set of instructions, except they were asked to describe a time that their father was present for an important event when they really needed him. Just to give you a quick sample of that. So this girl wrote, the first day of college when I came to move into my dorm, my father came with me to help. Even though most fathers came to help their daughters, it still meant a lot that I didn't even have to ask him to come. He wanted to all on his own. He helped me load the car and unload it when we finally got to TCU. It made me feel like he wanted to be a part of my life, and something that was important to me was also important to him. I sometimes take for granted the little things my parents do for me, but this time I really realized he was there for me, and it made me feel proud of myself, and that going to school and being on my own was a big accomplishment. So definitely activating different states than what we saw with the father disengagement prime. And so again, following this priming procedure, participants were presented with our dependent measure, which in this study was a word stem completion task used in previous research to assess activation of sexual thoughts. So this is just, and again, this is taken from previous research, but just to give you an idea of the words. And I'm sure all of you are completing them like that. The sad part is I've been doing this for so long. It took me like 5 minutes to complete this without putting a sexual word in. I couldn't even see it any other way. But so the results of this experiment demonstrated that girls who were asked to describe a time that their father was absent actually completed a greater number of these word stems in a sexual way relative to participants who described a time that their father was present for an important event. So this provided some evidence that we can actually activate these states in the laboratory and produce results that are consistent with what we would expect based on paternal investment theory. But again, it's a word stem task, and it might not be the most valid. How often, it doesn't necessarily reflect what would unfold in the real world. So we also wanted to assess whether or not we could get comparable effects when it came to women's more explicit attitudes. So the priming procedure in this experiment was exactly the same as in the first experiment, except in this case, participants were presented with a measure of sexual attitudes. So they were presented with 3 statements and asked to rate their agreement. And the statements were, sex without love is okay. I can imagine myself being comfortable and enjoying casual sex with different partners. And I would have to be closely attached to someone before I could feel comfortable and fully enjoy having sex with him. And we also, in this study, presented the positive and negative affect schedule, just to ensure that any results we might obtain couldn't be accounted for solely based on differences in negative or positive affect evoked by the prime. And what we found here was that relative to participants who described a time that dad was present for an event, girls who described a time that dad was absent for an event reported more permissive sexual attitudes, so greater willingness or acceptance of engaging in uncommitted or casual sexual behaviors. So taken together, the results of these first 2 experiments, A, sort of validate our priming procedure, and B, suggest that father disengagement may lead to shifts in women's sexual attitudes and perceptions that could potentially contribute to some of the risky sexual behaviors that we see in sort of playing out in the real world in response to paternal, low-quality paternal investment. But as we remember, after discussing paternal investment theory, we expect that these effects should be specific to fathers, and we shouldn't see effects like this when it comes to maternal investment quality. So the goal of the next experiment was to test whether or not these effects would be specific to father engagement, or father disengagement. So the control condition in this study was having participants describe a time that their mother was absent for an important event. So the instructions were exactly the same as with the father, except we replaced father with mother. And again, the dependent measures were sexual attitudes, similar to the items that we just saw. And participants were also asked to indicate the number of sex partners that they expected to have over the next 5 years. And again, consistent with our first set of results, we see that participants who described a time that dad was absent reported more permissive sexual attitudes relative to girls who described a time that their mother was absent for an important event. They also reported expecting to have a greater number of sex partners over the next 5 years. So it seems that relative to mother absence, father absence is increasing women's explicit sexual attitudes and behavioral intentions. But would we see similar effects when it comes to sexual perceptions? So we saw it with the word stems relative to paternal engagement, but would we see it when we're using mother disengagement as the control condition? And here we switched up our dependent measure a little bit to make it slightly more ecologically valid. So in this experiment, we used an emotion perception task. I'll tell you a little bit about this task. So the women across both conditions were presented with 4 male target faces, and they were asked to rate the amount of sexual arousal, anger, and fright that they perceived each man to be experiencing. And these men were all instructed to have neutral faces on, so they weren't really experiencing anything. but we wanted to see if women would perceive the men to be experiencing more sexual arousal. And we found a significant two-way interaction between priming condition and target emotion. So we didn't see any significant differences based on condition for the amount of anger or the amount of fright that the men were perceived to be experiencing. However, we did get a significant between conditions effect when it came to the amount of sexual arousal that women believed that these men were experiencing. So women who described a time that their father was absent perceived that the male targets were experiencing greater sexual arousal relative to participants in the control condition. So taken together, these results provide some support for predictions derived from paternal investment theory regarding the specificity of these effects to fathers relative to mothers. So father, but not mother disengagement, increased women's sexual permissiveness, their expected number of sex partners, as well as the amount of sexual arousal that they perceived in the male target faces. So the next question, at least again based on the specific predictions laid out by paternal investment theory, is it specific to sexual risk? So far we've focused solely on outcomes related to sexual risk. And again, we expect specific targeted effects on this type of risk-taking based on what male investment cues are telling girls and the appropriate way to respond in those types of contexts. But again, we don't expect that we're going to see a generalized shift in risk-taking, but we haven't explicitly tested that yet, so that is what we're going to do next. So again, participants in the control condition were asked to describe a time that their mother was absent for an important event. And our dependent measures here were basically measures of non-sexual risk-taking and immediate gratification. So our sort of global attitudes towards risk-taking measure included statements such as, I enjoy taking risks, I like to be spontaneous, I seek thrilling experiences. So just general global attitudes toward any kind of risk-taking. And we also wanted to rule out the possibility that maybe these girls are just getting worse or expressing a greater preference for immediate gratification, and it's just playing out in a sexual domain. So here we wanted to test to see if we would get any effects in terms of women's desire for immediate gratification in non-sexual domains. So specifically related to food and money. So they were asked to rate their agreement with statements like, I can resist junk food when I want to, or I enjoy spending money the moment I get it. And we see here that we did not get any between conditions effects in terms of women's preference for non-sexual risk or gratification. And actually, there was a slight trend with those who described mom being absent for an important event being slightly higher in terms of their preference for or their attitudes toward general risk-taking or immediate preference for immediate gratification. So again, consistent with paternal investment theory, father disengagement did not increase women's desire for non-sexual gratification or risk. So we tested the relative effects of mothers versus fathers, relative effects of sexual versus non-sexual risk. That leaves us with one more thing, testing whether these effects are specific to daughters. And in this experiment, we included male and female participants. And the father disengagement prime was exactly the same as it was across the other experiments, except in this experiment, our control condition was describing a time that one's friend, close friends, let them down or was absent when they needed them. And our dependent measure here was attitudes towards condom use. So we presented participants with 7 items designed to assess their negativity toward using condoms. So items like, I dislike using condoms due to reduced sexual pleasure, condoms are inconvenient, and again, participants rated their agreement with these statements. And the results of this experiment revealed 2 separate main effects. So first, perhaps not surprisingly, men overall have more negative attitudes toward condom use relative to women. And there was also a main effect of priming condition such that collapsed across participant sex. Participants who described a time that their father was absent for an important event reported more negative attitudes toward condom use relative to participants in our control condition. And finally, when looking at simple effects within participant sex, we see that for men, although father disengagement was associated with the trend indicating more negative attitudes toward condom use, this difference wasn't statistically significant. For women, it just barely was statistically significant, with women who described a time that their father was absent, reporting more negative attitudes relative to participants in a control condition. And this is consistent with the results we saw earlier with father, I believe, connectedness being associated with increased risk-taking in a way that was stronger for daughters relative to sons. So father disengagement increased negativity toward condom use, more for women than for men, again consistent with what we would expect based on paternal investment theory. Just kind of to present all of the results in one place, breaking down by comparison. Again, the goal of these experiments was to test how fathers affect daughters in terms of their sexual decision making. And the results suggested that primed experiences of father absence increased activation of sexual thoughts and permissiveness of sexual attitudes, and these shifts were not accounted for by increases in negative affect in response to reminders of father absence. When comparing the effects of fathers versus mothers, those who described a time of father disengagement reported greater perceived greater sexual arousal in male target faces. They also reported expecting to have a greater number of sexual partners. We saw that the effects of father disengagement were specific to sexual risk, and also that the effects were stronger for daughters relative to sons. So taken together, the results suggest that paternal disengagement may have a causal impact on women's sexual attitudes and perceptions, consistent with what we would expect based on paternal investment theory. Now, although these were all fabulous studies, they were not perfect. There were several sort of limitations, and I'm going to highlight the three big ones and how we are attempting to address them currently. So for one, or first, we were limited in our use of, or our sole reliance on self-report measures as dependent measures. So in a couple of weeks at TCU, they're launching an experiment that's kind of similar to the Hetherington study that I talked about earlier, where they're going to assess differences in women's behavior when interacting with a male confederate following our priming procedure. So seeing if we can get similar shifts in terms of women's flirting behavior. We actually have tested this. I just haven't had a chance to analyze the data yet. But we're also working on testing whether or not these cues also influence expectations about male investment. So a critical piece of paternal investment theory is that girls are taking these cues and encoding them as suggesting that they imply something about the availability of male investment. And although it's not critical that these shifts are conscious, we are going to test whether or not we do see explicit shifts in women's expectations in terms of male investment, both in themselves, their romantic partners, and their offspring. And finally, another big limitation is that most of the participants in these experiments were from pretty well-off families. I think about 75% of them were from intact homes. So we don't really know yet how these types of priming procedures are going to interact with actual histories of father absence. So it's possible that an actual history of father absence is going to exacerbate some of the effects of the primes, where maybe women will react strongly when these, this history is sort of made salient, or maybe it'll completely wash out the effects of the prime because the history is so strong. We don't know that yet. We're collecting data on that, and we're going to test that. And we're also going to incorporate some of these methods into the differential sibling exposure design. that I talked so eloquently about earlier in my talk. So in conclusion, consistent with paternal investment theory, paternal disengagement produced specific attitudinal and perceptual shifts among women that may promote risky sexual behaviors and that may contribute to some of the behavioral outcomes that we see associated with father absence and low quality paternal investment playing out in the real world. So I want to thank you all for being here today. My funding sources, Dr. Bruce Ellis, my collaborators, graduate students, and research assistants. And I will take
I have two questions. So the first question is, when you looked at disengagement, did you also think about, or are you going to look at disengagement with a father actually in the home? So for example, somebody who's physically there but completely disengaged versus disengagement meaning physical absence?
So you mean in terms of requesting them to write about something specific or just crossing it with actual history of those things? Because most of these girls were father present, so most of them were they were growing up with dad in the home. I mean, they were away at college, but most of them had a history of dad being there physically. So we didn't look at differences in his quality, and we allowed them to write about physical or psychological absence to kind of cast a wider net in terms of what they can write about, because some of these girls are very resistant to writing anything negative about dad. So I don't know if that...
Well, I meant in your study, I thought you were just looking at the risky sexual behavior was just looking at either present or, so maybe I misunderstood. So I thought it was either present or disengaged, and disengaged meant they were either through divorce or death. But what you're saying is it could also be disengaged in that they're in the home and disengaged. See what I'm saying? So I was thinking of more of it three-pronged, like divorce is disengaged, death is disengaged, obviously qualitatively different, right?
Yeah.
But then, and then just somebody who lives in the home but is just completely disengaged, right? So anyway.
So assessing differences in actual background experiences with those things, yeah, that's a good point. And we're going to kind of start, the slide's gone, but we're going to start looking at some of those different components. So first, looking just at a history of absence versus presence, but also this design, when we incorporate the prime, is also going to allow us to A, assess differences in paternal investment quality, B, assess differences in amount of experience with actual absence, and C, kind of multiply it out by the number of years and compare it across sisters. So we'll be able to tackle just about all of those questions in terms of investment quality versus presence absence, but we are ruling out from both of those studies of girls who are father absent due to death. Because the number is so small, we wouldn't have enough to test for differences, and we expect that it is qualitatively different from absence due to. Yeah.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, did you control for their current relationship status?
No, we didn't. I mean, most of them I can say were unmarried, so I know that it's not great.
I
But
was thinking of maybe dating versus not dating may be impacting the number of projected sexual partners.
Yeah, and that was a big concern. Not necessarily the dating versus not dating, just the sexual restrictedness as a baseline of our participant pool. And if you notice I didn't present a lot of information about scale points because not many people care about number of scale points, but if you knew the number of scale points and you saw the where these means were falling on the y-axis, most of the means, even in the father disengagement condition, were below the midpoint. So we're looking at variation at the sort of sexually restricted end of the sexual spectrum. But in terms of parsing out whether they were dating or not, we didn't do that in these experiments. None of the girls were married, so there's that. And I know in the behavioral study that they're about to launch, we're ensuring that all girls are single. So, I mean, we could potentially still see attitudinal shifts, even if girls are, kind of seeing someone. But yeah, it could certainly affect expectations regarding sexual partners. And even when we present the SOI, which is an individual difference measure, we'll get like write-in candidates where it's like, I'm going to have 0 sexual partners unless I get married, and then I'll have 1 sexual partner. So they like, it's something that we kind of had to keep an eye on in those cases.
It was random assignment.
Oh, that too. Yeah, so we expect that there weren't any systematic between conditions differences in, relationship status if, that ended up being a concern.
It's a great presentation, thank you. I'm thinking about the Hetherington study where there were differences between the girls who had fathers who were no longer around because of divorce versus death, and then like the differences between the sister pairs who had different exposure to their dads. And I'm wondering if it's having that exposure to dad and then losing it. So it makes me think about daughters who would be raised in homes where there was never a father present. A single mom who adopted a kid or something like that. Like, what do you think would happen in those circumstances?
I mean, I think it all depends on what types of cues or like how they're encoding that information, basically. And something that I always think is kind of interesting, and I've had this discussion with a former graduate student colleague of mine at TCU who was married, and she had a kid, and she would always want to come in and talk to me about father absence, which I always thought was kind of like, But so there could be something about how mom is reacting. So if mom is putting out attitudes like, oh, men are bums, and you look at your dad, he didn't stick around. Whereas if this was something that was planned, and so I think that there are important cues that girls can get from how mom responds or how mom feels. But I think it's not like yes or no. It's kind of like shades of gray where this might lead to a little bit more riskiness than this. So I think it's kind of a complicated thing. Yeah. Oh no, your turn.
Oh, okay. I'm wondering if in the future study, I know with the sibling design, and this is something Bruce has done before, is if you can talk about timing. So I'm assuming, if you ask an 18-year-old about paternal disengagement, most of them are going to be like in the last 4 years. Yeah. But I'm an early childhood person, and really no one remembers what happens to them before they're 3, and I know that's not something you can control, but are you looking at differences like pre-puberty, post-puberty? Is that something you're able to tap into? In terms of maternal disengagement, which I know might be hard for people to report, but is that something you can get a maternal history on maternal presence or non-presence earlier in life? We're looking at all of the things. Okay, so we're looking at actual history and actual experiences with fathers, with mothers, we're recruiting strictly girls whose parents divorced when the younger sister was younger than 13. Okay. So we're going to be able to account for those types of differences. And then in terms of what the primes are going to do, we're not sure yet. We've only tested these procedures in college samples, 18 to 19, 20-year-old girls, all of them probably still very dependent on dad, none of them into their own adult committed relationships yet. So we've kind of had to tackle a lot of these issues beforehand, and we still don't know exactly how the priming will work out with the adult girls. Mm-hmm. It might be a little bit different from what we've gotten in past studies with the college students. But I didn't even think about the timing of when you will ask them about maternal disengagement. So that's really interesting.
But we're asking about primarily sexual risk and relationships with parents that happened when they were about high school age, so adolescents. Yeah.
So I have 2 questions. One was sort of going along with the same one here. Do you think the same results would be shown for women who were raised by like a lesbian couple, where there never really was a father, but there was also no absence of a parent, so they were brought up kind of? Yeah.
And that's a very common question, and I think it's an interesting question. I don't think anyone has looked at that, but I think it, based on this logic, it depends on what sort of cues they're receiving. So I expect that the cues that they would be receiving from, being raised with lesbian parents is going to be different from somebody who's being raised in a single parent home or who's a child of divorce. So I personally don't necessarily expect that we would see similar shifts. I don't know what would happen. It hasn't been tested, but I think that that experience is going to be qualitatively different from growing up, or being a product of divorce. I don't think male absence in that situation provides the same information about the local mating context as a man or a father basically leaving the home.
And then I had a second one. Yeah. So I know that you guys are mostly looking at women, and there's definitely something inherently different between the genders. But do you think the opposite would be true with sons in an absence of mothers?
Do you mean in the real world?
Younger, yeah.
That's not my area of expertise. Do I think that? No. And actually, I'm just going to say no, because I'm trained somewhat as an evolutionary psychologist, and part of what's so special, and I'm going to say special, not necessarily adding a value judgment to it, but part of what makes this stuff work is the fact that male investment is incredibly variable. So male investment in children is much more variable than maternal investment in children. So this sort of renders itself to, when we see different levels of male investment playing out, they usually provide some sort of information that's meaningful. And people pay attention to that, and girls pay attention to that because there is variability to pay attention to. On average, mothers invest pretty consistently high. They have to invest at minimum 9 months, usually because they've invested that long. They're going to continue and see that through. So the information, mothers are less likely to leave than fathers, and B, because it's less variable, it's just not as an informative cue. At least that's what I think. Yes, Rich.
First of all, this was fantastic. Thank you. This was great. And this may be a question that you and I will talk about another time, but the
Sure.
critical implications of this.
Mm-hmm.
What might one do with a young teenage girl or a pre-teenage girl whose dad is long gone?
Right.
Moving forward, any kind of approach to help offset
Yeah.
some of this.
I mean, ideally, just thinking about my own research, let's say it turns out that we can pinpoint exact, shifts in expectations regarding male investment or perceptions of male investment. So, activating these cues leads girls to think that men don't invest or male investment isn't something forthcoming. That could be one area where, if that turns out to be the case, that there's some sort of, reinforcement of the fact that just because maybe your dad didn't stay or didn't invest, doesn't necessarily generalize to all men. So we can tackle it that way. The other thing is that we're going to get to see with, crossing our primes with actual history of absence and presence, if among girls with a history of father absence, remembering a time that dad was there and was present and was investing, if we see some sort of effect indicating that actually it drives down their sexual perceptions or drives down their attitudes relative to, some of the other combinations, that would be something that would be promising, or, at least something to look into.
You mentioned, the maternal cues that the daughter might be picking by the absence of father. So are you also looking at and measuring that to their perceptions of, if the mom is talking crap about the dad when they're not around, or if it's a more positive, feeling within the home, or that the mother's trying to reinforce that about their father? Are you looking at that at all?
Up to this point, it has only been me including an item out of curiosity. So the part that I dislike most about this research is figuring out what to do with the essays. So there are some girls who just won't even indulge the thought of the fact that dad wasn't there for anything. So dad never missed anything. He never missed a birthday, or he was always there. And then they'll basically write a paragraph about why their dad is the best dad. So the worst part about this is trying to figure out what to do, like which essays are acceptable and which aren't. And just some of what I've been looking at and, just sitting around doing these things, I guess, is I'll ask them, how stressful was this event for your mom? Like, how did your mom react during this event that you described? Just as sort of an easy, clear-cut way to just start looking at differences without having to go through and read every single essay. And, we've never done it in published research, but just if you kind of restrict the sample to girls who said, yeah, this was an event that also was stressful to my mom, everything just pops. Like, all the effects are so much stronger. So to me, and even some things that I've read in previous literature, it just seems like if they're taking in cues and they're trying to figure out what these cues mean, and mom is giving them some sort of cue that's basically reinforcing their perspective that men don't invest, that's not what they do, and this is something that you should be upset about, that's going to kind of reinforce that. But in terms of systematically looking at that, it hasn't gone beyond casual curiosity at this point.
My guess, another early childhood person in the back here how you doing? This really is a bonding issue, and it probably happens in the first 3 years of life, and that would also explain why you might have a father who's somewhat present, gets idealized, and then later on is absent.
Mm-hmm.
Or but the first 3 years of life are so hard to do because you can't anecdotally go back and say, well, did dad change your diaper or help you doodle, because the memories we have are much later than that.
Right.
But bonding theory really is going to be, evolutionary speaking, is really settled, or the foundations lay positive or negative expectation, where can I trust, or is, and my big fear now is, where's dad? He's over here doing this when the kid's in the swinging, or worse, has an iPad in front of us.
Yeah. Yes, and that would be consistent also with an evolutionary perspective that posits that these effects are, that girls are especially sensitive to these cues early on. And we saw that effects on that second slide where presence, late absence, early absence just skyrockets.
Great presentation.
That's it. Thank you all again for being here.